Federal agents put my HOA president in handcuffs on a quiet Thursday morning, and the strangest part wasn't watching my neighbors peek through their curtains with coffee mugs still in their hands. It was looking across the street at the little patch of wildflowers that started the whole mess and realizing they were swaying peacefully in the breeze like none of it had ever happened. 6 weeks earlier, that same man had smiled while telling my husband and me we probably lose the house we'd spent 32 years paying for, all because he claimed our front yard violated community standards. If you'd told me back then that those flowers would eventually uncover nearly $1 million in stolen money and send one of the most respected men in our subdivision to federal prison, I would have laughed and asked what movie you'd been watching. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 65 years old, and before retirement I spent almost 3 decades working as a financial investigator for the Treasury Department. Most people hear that and imagine flashing badges and dramatic arrests, but the truth is far less glamorous. My job was usually just long nights, spreadsheets, bank records, and learning one simple lesson over and over again: money always leaves footprints, no matter how carefully someone tries to sweep them away. My husband, Walter, retired from a local electric company years ago. He's the kind of man who waves at every passing car, fixes neighbors' broken lawnmowers without charging them a dime, and somehow remembers the name of every dog in the neighborhood while forgetting where he left his reading glasses every morning. We weren't rich, never tried to be. We bought our little brick house outside Austin back when interest rates made people cry, raised 2 daughters there, buried 2 golden retrievers in the backyard, celebrated anniversaries under the old oak tree, and finally mailed off the last mortgage payment with a bottle of cheap champagne because that's what normal people do when they finally own something outright. We figured retirement would be simple: coffee on the porch, church on Sundays, gardening whenever Walter felt like getting dirt under his fingernails. Those wildflowers weren't planted to make some political statement or upset anyone. Walter just loved native plants because they attracted butterflies and bees, and honestly they look prettier than the identical rows of imported shrubs everyone else kept replacing every summer. Kids walking home from school sometimes stopped to look at them. Older couples asked what they were called, and even delivery drivers occasionally slowed down to admire them. I never imagined flowers could make enemies. Things around the neighborhood started changing after Grant Holloway became HOA president. Before that, the association mostly handled boring things: fixing entrance lights, organizing yard sales, sending reminders about trash pickup. Grant was different. He was younger than most board members, sharp dresser, expensive watch, always talking about increasing property values and protecting investments. At first, people admired him because he sounded confident. Then the warning letters started showing up. One family got fined because their basketball hoop stayed in the driveway overnight. Another because holiday decorations remained up 3 days longer than allowed. An elderly widow received a violation over faded shutters she couldn't afford to repaint. Every monthly meeting felt less like neighbors solving problems together and more like a courtroom where Grant always played judge and jury. Most people grumbled privately but paid whatever they were told because nobody wanted legal trouble. Then came that Tuesday afternoon I'll never forget. Walter brought the mail inside, tossed a stack of advertisements onto the kitchen counter, and quietly handed me a certified envelope. He didn't say anything, but I noticed his smile had disappeared. Inside was a formal notice claiming our landscaping violated HOA regulations and demanding $85,000 in fines, plus administrative penalties that somehow pushed the total above $100,000. We had 60 days to pay or foreclosure proceedings would begin. I read it twice, then a third time, certain I'd misunderstood something. Walter leaned against the counter and whispered, "Honey, is this real? I honestly didn't know." I called the number listed at the bottom, expecting some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a calm conversation. Instead, Grant answered on the second ring. His voice sounded almost amused before I finished introducing myself. I explained there had to be a mistake because our garden only contained state-approved native wildflowers. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Mrs. Carter, people always think the rules don't apply to them until reality shows up. You can argue with me all day, but unless that money arrives within 60 days, you'll be packing boxes instead of planting flowers." I told him foreclosure over flowers sounded ridiculous. His reply still echoes in my head. "You and your husband are retired. You don't have the money to fight this. People like you always fold eventually." Then he hung up. Walter looked at me from across the kitchen waiting for me to explode. But instead I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: curiosity. Because arrogant people make mistakes, and the truly dangerous ones always believe nobody is paying attention. I walked into my home office, turned on the old desktop computer I'd promised my daughters I'd eventually replace, opened a fresh spreadsheet, and quietly said to myself, "Let's see what you're hiding." My investigation started with a single public financial report, and before the sun came up the next morning, I already knew one thing for certain. This was never about flowers. The numbers didn't just look wrong. They looked terrified of being examined. If you want to know what I found first, the first thing I noticed wasn't a missing dollar amount or some dramatic transfer to an offshore account. It was something much stranger. The reserve fund balance reported to homeowners simply didn't match the yearly contributions listed in the same report. At first glance, it looked close enough that most people would never question it. But that's the trick about financial fraud. People expect thieves to be reckless, when the smartest ones stay just believable enough that nobody bothers pulling out a calculator. I made a fresh pot of coffee, opened another spreadsheet, and started rebuilding the HOA's finances from scratch using every public document I could legally obtain. Annual budgets, county filings, contractor permits, tax records, vendor registrations. By lunchtime, my dining room table looked like an accountant had exploded across it. Walter wandered in carrying 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and smiled. "You have that look again." I asked him what look. He chuckled. "The one you used to have when somebody on television got arrested a week after you said they would." I laughed because he wasn't wrong. During my career, I'd learned that numbers behave like witnesses. Honest numbers tell the same story no matter who asks the questions. Fake numbers panic the moment you compare them with reality. Every time I recalculated the HOA reserve account, I came back to the same impossible conclusion. Nearly $800,000 had quietly disappeared over 4 years. Not overnight. Not in one giant transfer. Little pieces, 22,000 here, 14,000 there, 38,000 labeled as emergency drainage repairs that never happened. Landscaping invoices paid to companies nobody in the neighborhood had ever seen. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. I leaned back in my chair and whispered, "You're not stealing because you're desperate. You're stealing because you've convinced yourself nobody's smart enough to notice." The next morning, Walter and I drove around the subdivision pretending we were just enjoying the weather. We stopped near the entrance where records claimed $45,000 had recently been spent replacing irrigation equipment. The sprinklers were the exact same rusted heads I'd watched sputter water for years. We drove past the walking trail supposedly resurfaced twice in 18 months. Same cracked pavement, same broken benches. According to HOA records, a new playground safety surface had been installed behind the clubhouse 6 months earlier. Children were still kicking dirt across faded mulch. Walter looked at me and quietly asked, "So where did all that money go?" I answered with words I'd spoken dozens of times during my career. "It went somewhere somebody hoped nobody would ever look." That afternoon, I visited the county clerk's office under the excuse of checking property filings. Most people don't realize how much information is public if you're patient enough to dig through it. I found contractor licenses, business registrations, lien records, and one company name kept appearing over and over on HOA payments: Green Valley Property Services. Nearly $300,000 paid across several years. Odd thing was, the registered business address belonged to a mailbox rental store. No warehouse, no office, no equipment yard. Just a tiny mailbox between a nail salon and a shipping center. I drove there myself. The young woman behind the counter politely confirmed they rented private mailboxes to dozens of businesses but obviously couldn't discuss clients. She didn't have to. I'd already seen enough. Shell companies rarely advertise themselves. They simply hide behind ordinary addresses because nobody asks questions. By then, I knew Grant wasn't just abusing HOA authority. He was building something much larger. That evening, one of our neighbors, Linda Ramirez, knocked on our door carrying a peach cobbler she'd baked for Walter. She looked nervous. After a few minutes, she quietly admitted she'd also received a massive violation notice 3 months earlier because her grandson's wheelchair ramp supposedly wasn't approved. She borrowed money from her sister to pay nearly $18,000 because she was terrified of losing her home. 2 days later, another neighbor stopped by after hearing Linda had visited. Then another. By the weekend, our kitchen had unofficially become neighborhood confession headquarters. An older veteran had been fined over an American flag bracket mounted 2 inches too low. A young couple paid thousands because their fence stain was supposedly the wrong shade. Every story sounded different, but the ending never changed. People paid because they were afraid. Fear, I realized, had become Grant's most profitable source of income. Walter listened quietly while everyone talked. After the last neighbor left, he looked at me with tears sitting in the corners of his eyes. Evie, these people trusted him. That hurt more than the stolen money. Financial crimes aren't really about dollars. They're about the trail. Every fake invoice represented somebody skipping vacations, delaying retirement, working overtime, believing their HOA dues were protecting the community. Instead, they were financing someone's private lifestyle. I dug deeper. Credit card statements hidden inside reimbursement reports revealed expensive steakhouse dinners mysteriously labeled as board development meetings. Luxury hotel stays became conference expenses. Electronics purchases magically transformed into office equipment. Every fraudulent transaction looked ordinary by itself. Together, they painted the portrait of a man who genuinely believed homeowners existed to finance his ego. But one detail bothered me more than anything else. Our violation notice had arrived at the exact end of the fiscal quarter, just days before financial statements would be presented to the board. I reopened every previous quarterly report and suddenly saw the pattern. Whenever reserve funds dropped below expected projections, unusually large fines appeared against homeowners. Most weren't actually collected immediately, but they were listed as anticipated revenue, making the books temporarily appear healthier than reality. I actually laughed out loud when I realized what he'd done. Walter looked up from the television. "What's funny?" I shook my head. "He isn't using fake fines to enforce HOA rules. He's using fake HOA rules to explain stolen money." That was the moment everything snapped into focus. We were never chosen because of flowers. We were chosen because our house had enough equity to make us believable targets. If we'd panicked, sold investments, borrowed against the property, or settled quietly, our payment would have filled the latest financial hole just long enough for Grant to keep the scheme alive another quarter. We weren't victims of bad luck. We were inventory. That realization lit a fire inside me I hadn't felt since my investigative days. I spent the next 48 hours building what agents call a prosecutable timeline. Every suspicious payment connected to corporate records, every corporate record connected to addresses, every address connected to financial beneficiaries, every fraudulent fine connected to accounting shortages, every shortage connected to Grant's authorization signature. I wasn't trying to prove he looked guilty. I wanted to make innocence mathematically impossible. Then I turned my attention back to the flowers. If I was going to destroy his financial scheme, I also wanted to eliminate the very excuse he'd used to threaten us. I contacted a retired environmental attorney I'd once met during a federal task force years earlier. He reviewed photos of our landscaping, smiled, and pointed me toward state conservation statutes protecting native pollinator species. Then he noticed something else, something I'd completely overlooked. The HOA had never legally filed our violation according to state property procedures. No proper hearing, no certified compliance timeline, no documented appeal process. In plain English, the foreclosure threat itself had never been legally enforceable. Grant hadn't simply exaggerated his authority, he'd invented it. I leaned back in my chair, closed the folder, and looked out the front window at Walter watering those same wildflowers while butterflies drifted lazily across the yard. Grant thought those flowers made us weak. In reality, they had forced him into making the one mistake every con artist eventually makes. Getting greedy enough to pick the wrong target. By sunrise the next morning, I wasn't wondering whether I'd expose him anymore. I was deciding which federal agency deserved the first phone call. I made 3 phone calls before 9 o'clock that morning, and every one of them lasted less than 15 minutes. The first went to the state licensing board because Grant wasn't just an HOA president. He was also a licensed financial advisor, which meant he was held to a much higher standard than the average person handling community funds. The second call went to a federal financial crimes task force where, by pure coincidence, one of the investigators happened to be someone I'd worked alongside years earlier. He recognized my voice immediately and laughed before saying, "Evelyn, you only call me when somebody's life is about to get complicated." I told him, "Only if they've earned it." The third call went to the county records office requesting certified copies of several filings I'd already identified. By lunchtime, I had organized everything into one clean package. Timelines, spreadsheets, payment histories, corporate registrations, copies of fraudulent violation notices, state property statutes, photographs of our landscaping, and a summary explaining exactly how every piece connected. I wasn't asking anyone to believe my opinion. I was simply handing them facts that all pointed in the same direction. About a week later, two federal investigators knocked on our front door. They spent nearly 4 hours sitting at our kitchen table, while Walter kept refilling coffee cups and apologizing because the cookies he baked had come out a little too crisp. One agent smiled and said, "Mr. Carter, we've interviewed bankers who were less prepared than your wife." Walter grinned proudly and answered, "I've been telling people that for 40 years. The investigation moved far faster than I expected. Once subpoenas started going out, banks produced records, vendors answered questions, and fake companies began collapsing almost immediately. Several contractors admitted they'd never performed work listed under their names. One accounting firm quietly confirmed invoices had been altered after approval. Even members of the HOA board appeared genuinely shocked when they realized many financial reports presented during meetings had never matched original documentation. Most of them weren't criminals. They'd simply trusted the wrong man. During those weeks, Grant kept acting as though nothing had changed. He continued sending warning letters, chaired board meetings, and even stopped by our property one afternoon with another landscaping citation tucked under his arm. He stood at the edge of our driveway wearing that same expensive smile I'd seen the day he mocked us over the phone. "Mrs. Carter," he called out, "you still have time to resolve this before things become unpleasant." I looked at him for a moment, then glanced toward Walter, who was kneeling beside the flower bed pulling a few weeds. I smiled politely and said, "Grant, if I were you, I'd spend less time worrying about my front yard and a lot more time organizing my financial records." For the first time since we'd met, his smile disappeared. It only lasted a second, just one tiny crack. But experienced investigators learn to notice moments exactly like that. He nodded without another word, turned around, and drove away. 52 days after our original violation letter arrived, Walter and I were eating breakfast when we heard tires crunch across the street. 3 unmarked SUVs rolled quietly into the neighborhood, followed by 2 marked federal vehicles. Curtains opened all over the subdivision. Front doors cracked open. Coffee cups froze halfway to people's mouths. Federal agents walked directly to Grant's house, knocked once, then entered after he answered. Nobody spoke. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. A few minutes later, Grant stepped outside wearing jeans and a polo shirt, his hands secured behind his back. One agent carried several evidence boxes. Another read charges that included wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and filing false financial documents. Grant looked around the neighborhood, searching every face except mine. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't celebrating. I simply stood beside Walter while butterflies floated through the same wildflower bed he'd once claimed justified taking our home. Walter reached over and squeezed my hand. "It's over," he whispered. I nodded, but I knew he was only half right. The arrests were only the beginning. Within weeks, the remaining board members resigned. Emergency elections were held. An independent management company took over community operations, and a full forensic audit confirmed nearly $900,000 had been misappropriated through fake vendors, inflated maintenance contracts, and fraudulent reimbursements. Homeowners who'd paid fabricated fines began receiving reimbursement checks. Several elderly residents cried during the first community meeting because they genuinely believed they'd never see that money again. Linda hugged Walter so hard I thought she'd crack one of his ribs. The young couple who'd nearly refinanced their home over fence violations brought homemade pies to every board meeting for months afterward. The neighborhood slowly became a community again instead of a collection of frightened people avoiding certified envelopes. As for us, every violation against our property was permanently withdrawn. The HOA formally apologized in writing, reimbursed our legal expenses, and completely rewrote its landscaping policies to comply with state protections for native plants. Today, our front yard is even fuller than it was before. The blue wildflowers spread a little farther every spring. Butterflies still arrive before sunrise, and neighborhood kids sometimes stop to count the bees while their parents smile instead of complaining. Walter likes to joke that those flowers turned out to be the most expensive plants anyone ever tried to remove. Maybe he's right. Looking back now, I don't think this story was ever really about flowers, money, or even one dishonest HOA president. It was about what happens when ordinary people convince themselves they have no power simply because someone speaks with confidence and carries an official title. Titles don't create truth. Paperwork doesn't erase facts. And bullies, no matter how polished they look, usually depend on one thing above all else: silence. Grant expected fear. He expected us to write a check, lower our heads, and quietly disappear like so many others before us. What he never expected was that two retired neighbors, one stubborn husband with dirty gardening gloves and one former financial investigator who still trusted numbers more than speeches, would decide that enough was enough. So now I want to ask you something. If someone threatened to take your home over something this ridiculous, would you have fought back? Or would you have paid just to make the nightmare end? And where do you think the line is between protecting a neighborhood and abusing power? Share your thoughts down in the comments because I honestly believe these conversations matter. If this story kept you watching until the end, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-world neighborhood and legal drama stories, and send this to someone who still believes one ordinary person can't make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to look a little closer, because the truth has a funny way of blooming where nobody expects it.